welcome back to Life Groups. We're in week 3 of our Collide series, all about this idea of being forgotten. So this will be a bit of a recap, whether you were at the weekend service or not. So we spent time this week in the last, on the story of 1 Samuel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 20, where we gained a better understanding of Samuel and where he actually came from, and the struggle that his mother had in actually even having him. And so the big idea for this past week was that God remembers us, even if we think he's forgotten. So how do I work through my bitterness when it feels like I've actually been forgotten? The first thing is I need to resist measuring myself up against others. The simple fact is that that life will not always be fair, and no one ever said that it would be. Sometimes others get hooked up before I do, and that's where I have to be careful not to act out of my broken places. What I need to realize is that not everyone is out to get me. Instead, I need to have a conversation with God, a conversation about my hurts that will actually help me with the perspective piece that tends to be the difficult things to embrace. Here's the deal. God can handle my pain. And not only can he handle it, but he gives me perspective that helps me push through it. So keep asking, keep seeking, keep having the conversation with God until he either says yes or no, or maybe it's simply not yet. So am I open to the different ways that God might encourage me? It helps to be open by getting back into a positive routine. And part of getting back into the routine is setting up consistent times that I participate in prayer. And the reason that we participate is because prayer was meant to be a conversation, which of course means sometimes when I'm praying, I need to learn to shut my mouth and live in the anticipation of God speaking directly to me. So ask this question. How do you think a person becomes forgotten? And what is the opposite of someone who has been forgotten? And how is their life potentially different? So go ahead and discuss.
Can you believe that we are already in week 3 of this video sermon-based life group? And we're in this series called Collide. Now, I want you guys to do something a little bit different than you normally might. So your facilitator usually closes your time together in prayer, of course. But today, I would like for you as a group to take a moment and try to think of somebody in your life who maybe you've not spoken to in a while, or lost track of, or maybe you've even forgot about them until right this second. Now, this could be a family member, or an old friend, or some former coworker. And after you think of this one person, I want your facilitator to split you guys up into one-on-one groups to pray for that person, like where they are in their faith, even if you don't know, and pray for an opportunity to connect with them and even restore something. I want you to think about that, like to restore something that might need to be repaired. So go ahead and begin. Now that you guys have had your prayer time, let's go ahead and talk about Jesus' life and how it collides into the forgotten life of a man born blind in John chapter 9. In this chapter, we see Jesus as he sees a man blind from birth sitting on the side of a path. And the disciples ask Jesus a very interesting question. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. You see, there was this common belief in Jewish culture, in the first century particularly, that the suffering of an individual was necessarily linked to some sin in their life or even in their family. And Jesus used this man's suffering to teach about faith and what it means to glorify God with one's life. I mean, unfortunately, the world is messed up and in a fallen state, a very fallen state. And because of this, sometimes good deeds go unnoticed and bad deeds go without consequence. And so people suffer. But anyway, what happens next in the story in John 9 is really interesting because Jesus then, it says he spits on the ground, and he makes mud with his saliva, and then he puts it on the man's eyes. I mean, you wonder what the blind man was thinking at this point. But instead, we see no record of a question or a response from him. He just follows Jesus' instructions and goes to this pool called Siloam to wash the mud off of his eyes. And I wonder if he was just maybe so excited that someone actually recognized him and spent time with him that he was compelled by the idea that he was not forgotten by everyone. And as soon as the mud was washed off his eyes, it says he came home seeing. I mean, his neighbors and those who'd formerly seen him begging all the time were confused if it was actually really him or and some, they just didn't even believe it, even though he had no problems with his vision. But the man told the community that it was him and that he had been totally, miraculously healed. I mean, can you imagine after all those years of being born with blindness that he was seeing for the first time? I mean, it must have been incredible. Imagine the colors. And as they asked him how it happened, he shared what Jesus had done. So before we go on, let's take a moment to look at the following question. Have you ever had a situation occur in your life where you found somebody who felt forgotten? Or maybe you were found and really felt appreciated by somebody else? So let's pick back up in the story because now the Pharisees, oh, those Pharisees, they're about to investigate the healing in verses 13 through 41. Now remember, I'm paraphrasing, and I want to encourage you to go back after your life groups and read the whole story again. Read it a couple of times. It will really help you to remember it better. Whenever you read things like that, it'll always get it in you more. Read them many times. So let's continue on. Now this man who had been born blind was brought before the Pharisees. The day that Jesus performs this miracle, it's on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees, they're super legalistic. And they had a list of all the things that people could not do in order to be holy and still observe the Sabbath. And then Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. Now some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath," when they're talking about Jesus. But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" And so they're all like divided and confused. And they still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for this guy's parents. They actually sent for his mom and dad, who then confirmed his condition and really must have been in shock. And the Pharisees called the blind man a second time, and he simply answered that, he was blind, but now he could clearly see. And Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." And Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." And then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. I love this part of the story because the Pharisees threw him out, a practice that I'm sure he was used to because remember, he was blind and kind of judged by their society. And he must have felt forgotten again, but now he could see it. But Jesus doesn't leave him to be forgotten. He gives him something greater than his sight. Jesus gives him insight about who he really was. And then with the Pharisees in the earshot of Jesus, he's still talking in verses 39 through 41. "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say it and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" And Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim that you can see, your guilt remains." After walking through this scripture, let's take a moment to do the following exercise in this next question. So I want you guys to read and scan through the text in chapter 9 of John and pick out the verse that you believe is kind of like the key verse of the story. And then share with the rest of the group what that key verse is to each of you. Now, as we end our time together, I want you to close on this question. Also, if you want to dig deeper, I want to encourage you to study other accounts of healings in the Bible. So here's the question. After reading this account, particularly this one, what can you do to reconnect with the person that you prayed for back at the beginning of our time together, earlier? Does this relationship need to be restored? Does this person need encouragement or maybe an invitation to have a greater role in your life?